He was old and he was cold, but in his time he had been the finest shoemaker that had lived in this town. People would argue and push and shove to get to his shop. But now, inside the old town, everything had moved away from the market square, and his shop was just that little bit too far for people to travel to. He still made shoes, but with less and less customers. He didn't have that much money, and now, on this night very close to Christmas, all he had was enough money to buy one piece of leather. He bought the leather, he cut it out, he placed it upon the table, but he was old and cold. And he said to his wife, "I am too tired now. I will make the shoes tomorrow." And he laid out all of the parts of the pieces of the shoe on top of the table and left them that night. But the next morning when he woke up and went downstairs, there, on top of the table, where it had all been cut out, it had been hammered and stitched, and two beautiful shoes had been made. The stitching was so tiny, he couldn't believe it. He shouted to his wife, "My wife, did you make those shoes?" She just looked at him. "Do I look like I'm the kind of person who can make shoes? I do not know where the shoes have come from, but let's take it as a miracle." And they placed the shoes in the window. Now it so happened that a very rich man was walking past, and he looked at the shoes, and as soon as he saw how finely they had been made, how well they'd been hammered, he decided that he would knock upon the door, and as the door creaked open, the old shoemaker said yes. The rich man looked and said, "I would wish to buy those fine shoes there. How much do you want for them?" The old shoemaker looked. He hadn't done any work. He looked and said, "I would wish to have 2 florins. The rich man looked at him. 2 florins? 2 florins? I will not give you 2 florins. I will not give you 2 florins. I will give you 5 florins because they are such fine shoes." He counted out the money. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 florins were placed in the old shoemaker's hand. The rich man put his shoes on and walked about the town and showed everybody just how fine he looked in these wonderful shoes. But now the old shoemaker had enough for 2 pieces of leather and some food. He and his wife that night, they sat by the side of the table and they cut out the pieces of leather for 2 pairs of shoes. But he was old and cold, and he thought that he would just leave the pieces of leather on top of the table and he would stitch them tomorrow. But his wife was very curious. She decided that in the middle of the night she would creep down to try and find out just who had made the shoes. She couldn't believe it. As she peeped round by the side of the curtain, she could see first a small ragged hat, and then a small face no bigger than your thumb, and then a body that was covered in a raggedy shirt and old trousers and poor shoes upon its feet. And then there was another hat and another face, and soon there were 2 elves who, with heads no bigger than your thumb and arms and legs no bigger than your fingers, could have fitted inside of her hand. And they climbed up the side of the table and they started to stitch and they started to hammer and they started to sew all of the shoes, and the old woman gasped. She'd never seen 2 fine fellows so small. She told her husband the next day. He didn't really believe her, but he was curious. When they had made the shoes, they'd left them behind and he put them in the window, and this time 2 rich people came, and when he asked for 2 florins, they said, "We will not give you 2 florins. We shall give you 5, 10 florins for each of the pairs of shoes." And now he had 20 florins. He had enough money to buy 4 pieces of leather and to make sure that their Christmas would be a good Christmas indeed. With all of the cutting, he was old and cold. He left all of the pieces of leather on top of the table. But this time he crept down the stairs with his wife, and the two of them peeped from behind the curtain, and sure enough they saw the raggedy hat. They saw the small heads no bigger than your thumb, the arms no longer than your fingers, the legs no longer than your small fingers, and they looked and saw that the hat upon their heads, and the shirts upon their backs, and the trousers on their legs, and the boots upon their feet were all worn, and they could do with some new clothes and shoes. So when they had made the shoes, and now lots of people came to the old cobbler's shop, they wanted him to make shoes for them. He decided, he and his wife, they would make some clothes for these two elves. They'd seen how big they were, how long their arms were, how long their legs were, and with small scraps of leather, on that Christmas Eve, they made a fine suit of clothes, 2 hats, 2 shirts, 2 trousers, and 2 pairs of finely stitched shoes. They also left for them 2 loaves of bread, no longer than your little finger. They left 2 cups of wine, no bigger than your thumb. And the 2 of them crept downstairs, and they watched, and they waited. And as it came to the stroke of midnight, they saw 2 hats, 2 bodies, 2 arms, 2 legs. And the 2 elves climbed up the table, but there was no leather there for them to cut, or stitch, or hammer, or sew. But there were hats and shirts, trousers and shoes. And the old man and his wife, they peeped from behind the curtain, and they laughed to themselves to see these 2 small men putting hats on their heads and shirts on their back, and new trousers that fitted them perfectly, and shoes upon their feet, and they ate at the bread and they drank at the wine, and they stopped. They looked at each other, these 2 elves, they looked at each other, and they realized that since these clothes fitted so well, that someone must have seen them. The 2 elves looked about. They could not see the old shoemaker and his wife hiding behind the curtain, but they knew that they'd been seen. The old man and the old woman, sometimes they would leave pieces of leather for them to stitch and sew, but the elves, once they've been seen, will never return. But it didn't matter. Everyone had heard about the fine shoes that the shoemaker made, not quite as good as the ones that the elves made. And people would pass by his shop and pay him florins till his pockets would burst. And every Christmas Eve they would lay out 2 loaves no bigger than your little finger, and 2 cups of wine no bigger than your thumbs. And every Christmas morning the cups would be empty, and all there would be on top of the table would be crumbs from 2 small loaves that had been eaten by their 2 small visitors.